structuré, bien appris, bien compris. Et aujourd'hui, nous allons poursuivre le travail et nous avons avec nous une collègue de AEM du nom de Luisa Freitas qui va nous entretenir d'un aspect parmi les plus essentiels, les plus fondamentaux du travail que les personnes font sur la migration. Vous savez, pour qu'un pays puisse mettre en place une politique de migration, pour qu'un État puisse protéger ses concitoyens à l'étranger, pour que l'État d'accueil puisse s'organiser pour assurer un meilleur séjour aux étrangers qui ont décidé de choisir son territoire pour y résider, il faut des informations, il faut des statistiques, il faut des éléments sur la base desquels l'État, la communauté économique régionale, l'organisation continentale puissent s'appuyer pour vraiment décider des mesures à prendre en ce qui concerne la migration. La chose est tellement importante que l'Union africaine s'est même dotée d'un centre qui est basé, d'un observatoire qui est basé actuellement au Maroc, dont l'une des tâches fondamentales est de réunir, d'analyser et d'interpréter toutes les statistiques concernant la migration en Afrique. C'est vous dire l'importance de telles statistiques pour l'Union africaine, mais c'est vous dire aussi que dans chacun de nos pays, nos structures chargées des statistiques ont un rôle fondamental à jouer pour permettre à l'État de connaître le nombre de personnes qui entrent, le nombre de personnes qui sortent, et pour l'État de s'organiser pour assurer vraiment la tranquillité, le séjour, pour faire en sorte que cette migration, cette mobilité des personnes se fasse dans les meilleures conditions. Donc, nous avons aujourd'hui une personne tout indiquée, puisque l'Organisation internationale des migrations est la structure créée par les Nations unies pour gérer la migration, non seulement au niveau international, mais pour aussi travailler avec l'Union africaine, avec les communautés économiques régionales africaines, avec les États africains, pour voir comment ils peuvent les aider, comment ils peuvent travailler ensemble pour non seulement produire des statistiques qui sont des statistiques justes, objectives, mais aussi des statistiques réelles, et les aider aussi à interpréter, à analyser ces statistiques de manière à ce que les politiques qui sont mises en place sont des politiques qui sont basées sur des informations qui sont justes, qui sont vraies, et des informations qui peuvent aider vraiment à trouver des solutions aux problèmes qui se posent. Donc, pour cela, nous avons demandé à nos collègues de l'AEM de nous aider à vraiment appréhender, à comprendre cette situation, comprendre ce problème. Et c'est pour cela aujourd'hui que nous avons l'honneur d'accueillir notre collègue Luisa Freitas, à qui je souhaite la bienvenue, et j'espère que les discussions qui vont avoir lieu aujourd'hui permettront à ce groupe de vraiment bien saisir tous ces éléments et qui permettront par la suite de comprendre les autres aspects qu'on va discuter dans les semaines à venir, parce qu'il nous reste encore 3 autres modules sur lesquels nous allons travailler avant la fin de ce cours annuel de 2022. Alors, avec votre permission, je vais demander à Luisa de faire sa présentation, à l'issue de laquelle on pourrait avoir, comme vous le savez, chaque fois, un jeu de questions-réponses qui vont permettre à Luisa de davantage préciser ses idées, d'apporter des éclairages sur des aspects que vous n'avez pas compris, et de vous permettre vraiment de sortir de cette rencontre mieux encore outillée pour gérer les questions de statistiques au niveau de la migration et de la mobilité des personnes en Afrique. Luisa, vous avez la parole et on vous donne peut-être 30 à 45 minutes pour vraiment éclairer notre lanterne sur cette problématique. Vous avez la parole, Luisa.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde. Bonjour. Alors, Désolée, je vais commencer par partager mon écran et vous me dites si vous le voyez, OK? Alors, tac.
Voilà, on le
Vous voyez mon
voit
écran?
tout à fait. Peut-être que c'est simplement, il faut l'agrandir de manière à ce que simplement,
Voilà.
voilà, exact.
Comme ça marche
Formidable.
bien?
Très bien. Maintenant, la parole est à vous.
Parfait. OK, très bien. Vous m'entendez? Vous voyez la présentation, ça c'est le plus important. Alors, je vais faire la présentation en anglais, donc n'hésitez pas à me dire s'il y a des soucis avec la traduction. Voilà, comme les slides, le PowerPoint aussi, il est en anglais. J'espère que ça pourra marcher pour vous. Okay, thank you everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the introduction. So as was said before, I work for the International Organization for Migration. And IOM believes that migration, when done right in an orderly and regular fashion, can be something that will benefit both migrants and host communities, as well as every party within that is involved in the migratory process. And as you were saying in the introduction, in order to have orderly and respected migration, we need to have data. We need to make sure that these informations are being well taken account for, and they are the basis for the decision-making that is done with it. Okay, so the objective of this course is really to tell you what role data plays within a migratory background and a migratory context. So this is module 4 of the course that EDEP is offering. And as I was telling you, this will be based on data for migration and how data can inform decision-making for migration. So, what are the topics that we're going to cover? We will be talking about key concepts and definitions and what are the traditional sources of data for migration. We will be talking about a global context for this. So we'll talk about the Sustainable Development Goals and how they talk about migration and data for migration. Afterwards, we're going to get more specific into the African context. So we will talk about migration in African development and how data is contributing to that. Afterwards, we will touch upon a topic of a lot of importance because it's where we have a lot of gaps, which is the disaggregation of data. We often talk about disaggregation by age, by gender, etc. But disaggregating data by migratory status is also very important and something that is not normally available. And we'll finish off by talking about data innovation. So how to include big data, how to include new data sources in migration research. And we'll talk about communication. So how to share migration data, what are the opportunities and the challenges that present themselves. And what are the objectives of this course? So the key objectives really are to identify key concepts, to be able to define what migration data is and what the key definitions are in this process. We also want to be able to understand what are the traditional sources of data for migration, and to build knowledge in terms of what are the initiatives that exist for migration, for migratory data in Africa. Okay, so let's begin then with the first topic, which is key concepts, definitions, and overview of the traditional sources. Okay, so who are migrants? Migrants this is a term that that has no legal definition to it. There is no consensus on what the definition, the legal definition of a migrant is. Okay, so this is something that might change with regards to the country that you're talking to or the institution that you're working with. And in terms to IOM, at least, we always think of migrants in the perspective of protection. So what's important for us is to think about the moment where someone's rights or someone's rights and duties, yes, can be limited or constrained by the fact of them not being in their usual place of residence anymore. So from the moment that you pass to another point in the country or you cross the border, you might not have the same rights as a person who was born there. And this remains a risk for you, right? This might put you in a situation of danger or might give you some added vulnerabilities in a situation of, let's say, a catastrophe or etc. And these are the kinds of situations that IOM wants to protect you against, okay? So that's normally what IOM is thinking about when we talk about definitions. So when we think about who migrants are, we might have, this is a very broad definition, okay? So we might think about foreigners that come to your country, right? They would be immigrants. They can be foreigners that are already living in the country as well. They can also be our citizens from our country that are living abroad, right? These are immigrants. But then we can also think about, you know, any nationality. Whenever people from any nationality move to another country, are they migrants? Are they going abroad? Are they coming into our country? There are many, many different factors that come into the consideration of what a migrant is, okay? So let's see. How do we define a migrant then? So as I was telling you, this is a very broad term. So it is an umbrella term, right? As I was telling you as well, it's not defined in international law. There is no common definition of what a migrant is, but the general understanding is that a migrant is a person who moves away from his or her place of usual residence, okay? And this is either within a country or across an international border, okay? So they can be internally displaced people, or they can be living in a different country. They can also be moving temporarily or permanently. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's for a day, for a week, for a year, or 20 years. They can be migrants, regardless of that. And for a variety of reasons. So it doesn't matter if you're moving because of conflict, if you're moving because of a flood, if you're moving because you're going to study abroad, if you're moving because you're going to be reunited with your family, it doesn't matter. Migrant is a very, very broad definition. So regardless of any of these, you can be defined as a migrant. Okay, and then since this is a very broad term, this will include very, different categories that I'm sure you've heard about. So migrant workers, right? So these are people that migrate. Why? Because they're looking for jobs. They're looking for economic opportunities. they are migrants. Also, persons whose particular types of movements are legally defined, such as smuggled workers. So again, being a migrant doesn't depend on you being a regular or an irregular migrant. You can be an irregular migrant, you can be a victim of trafficking, and you will also be a migrant, okay? And then to finish off, yeah, those that are international students, for instance, they can also be migrants, of course. As I was saying, the reason for this movement doesn't matter for us. They, as I was telling you, IOM thinks about this in the perspective of protection, of when someone's rights or can be limited, or when someone may be a little bit more constrained in what they can or can't do because they're no longer in their place of usual residence. For us, that's what matters, and that's what makes them a migrant. Okay, so then if there's no legal definition, how do we make sure that we're more or less talking about the same thing? What can we do to make sure that this goes well? So there are some recommendations by the United Nations in terms of the statistical definition of an international migrant. So we have practical guidances that UN member states have agreed to follow on how to collect statistics on migration. Of course, we need this, right? Because if we don't share a common methodology and a common definition of what a migrant is, then it's sure that we're not going to be able to collect the same kind of data, right? To share the same definition is the baseline that we need. So the first time that this was done was in 1953, and we were just focusing on, collecting data on arrivals and departures. But then little by little, these practical guidances got better and better. And now we have a very, very comprehensive and complete set of recommendations on how to collect information on migration, and making sure that we all share the same definitions. So let's see what the recommendations say. We might have, we will going to be touching upon 4 different definitions. So an immigrant, an emigrant, a long-term migrant, and a short-term migrant. Okay, so let's see. An immigrant in a country. So with an E, this is someone who is entering the country. He's crossing the border, he or she is crossing the border, and they're entering your country. They are not a usual resident of the country, and they stay there for at least 1 year. Okay, this is the recommendation for an immigrant. What is the definition for an emigrant? Well, as the name implies, right, it's going to be the contrary. So this is someone who will leave the country by crossing the border. He will be a usual resident of that country in which he is right now, and he needs to stay there for at least 1 year. Okay. And now let's go to the other type of definition. So long-term and short-term migrants. So a long-term migrant will be a migrant for at least 12 months. So he can either be immigrant or emigrant, but what matters is that the person is there for at least 12 months. And a short-term migrant, we account for 3 months, minimum 3 months, and maximum 12 months. Okay, that will be a short-term migrant. So in terms of international definitions, and just to make sure that we have some common ground, this is what we normally refer to. Now, again, there are always caveats to this. So these are UN recommendations, but sometimes they're not accepted by all of the countries. So the 12-month rule for immigrants and emigrants is not followed by all countries. This is important to know. And in some countries, the minimum length of stay to be considered a migrant is 6 months. So again, this is an effort to make sure that we all speak the same language, but it's not always possible. It's not always what happens, unfortunately, and that's also normal. There are more than 200 countries in the world. It would be difficult to agree on everything, but at least we have a definition that is accepted by the large majority. Okay, now let's talk about the difference between migrant stocks and migrant flows. So a migrant stock is what you see in the middle. We have, you see here, this part that I'm highlighting in the middle. So these are stocks. A stock of migrant is basically a photograph. This is a snapshot of all of the migrants, immigrants or emigrants that are in a specific point, in a specific moment in time there, right? So we go to a country, we say on the 30th of November of 2022, there are, I'm going to make it up, 1 million immigrants and inside that country, you know? So that is the stock of all the migrants that are present in a country in this moment in time. Okay, so this is the stock. Now, what are flows? The flows talk about movement, okay? The flows will talk about the number of migrants that are arriving. So that is an inflow, number of people that are arriving to a country. And we talk about outflow when we talk about the number of migrants that are departing, that are leaving the country. And this is during, 1 year, for instance. So I don't know, from January to December 2022, there were, I'm going to make it up, 300 people that entered the country. So that's an inflow. And there were 500 people that left the country during this year. So I hope this was clear. This is the difference between a stock. So this is a photograph of the number of people that are inside a country in one particular moment, so today, whereas the flows, they are numbers of people that are leaving or arriving to the country within a period of time, for instance, a year. Okay, I'm going to take questions at the end if I can. I see that I have some questions here. So yes, I know that the word stock has some problems to it. I don't particularly like using the word stock, but this is something that it is the international guideline to be used. UNDESA uses it in their bi-yearly, so twice a year, they share their international migrant stocks, and it is the term that is widely accepted. I don't particularly like it as well, but that's what we use. Is it accurate? Unless you're doing a census, it's probably not going to be accurate to to the unit, but we'll cover that in when we talk about sources of information. And the 12-month concept, it's exactly what I said. So that's it's just a rule. If it's less than 12 months, you are considered a short-term migrant. If it's more than 12 months, you're considered a long-term migrant. That's all. And yes, the definitions are not agreed upon exactly because of what Youssef is sharing. Thank you for that. Okay, so let's continue then. Next slide. Okay, and now we're going to discuss key traditional sources of migration data. So, as I was saying, a census is basically the best thing you can have, right? It is something that will give you very, very detailed information up until individual level about the numbers of people that are in your country, where they come from, why they are there, how long have they been there for. It's really, it's great. What's the problem? It's really expensive. And it really takes a long time to do it, which is why we only do it once every 10 years. It takes years to prepare a census. Anyone from a National Statistical Institute can tell you that. So these are great tools. They're the best, but they are extremely expensive and lengthy processes. So countries can't afford them to do them every time. You know, that's why we only do them once every 10 years. And that's it. But they are, of course, the golden standard and the best thing that we can have in terms of data. Now, afterwards, we have household surveys. So, as the name implies, this means that people, enumerators, will go to a household and they will ask the household questions about the people that are living there. These will give us very accurate information on why people are moving, and also on the consequences of those movements, on the impact of those movements, how that impacted, I don't know, the revenue that the family is getting, how that is impacting their ability to have an employment or not, et cetera, et cetera. So those are household surveys. And then we have administrative level. And here I will give you more information about this in a few slides. But basically, these are very, very good to have a sense of migrant flow. So through administrative data, we can know that, oh, okay, in the past 6 months, I don't know, 200 people left the country. You know, that's something that's very used. Whereas with a census here in the left, we're going to have a sense of stocks, because that's what the census is, right? It's in the year of 2010, we counted everyone that was in the country, and we have, I don't know, 5 million people, you know? So this is a snapshot. This is a photograph of what is happening in a moment in time. That's the census. Okay, next slide. So those were the traditional sources, and now we also have new sources of information. They are what we normally call big data, right? So what type of thing are we talking about? We're talking about mobile phone data. So data that is taken directly from your mobile phone. You connect to, I don't know, data for daily calls and where you're calling and sending messages from, or you connect to Wi-Fi and you have to answer a little survey. So that's mobile phone. Social media data. So directly from the data that people insert into their social networks, right? Be it Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. These are all, they all have public information about us, information that we agreed to share, of course. They cannot share anything that is private, but the public information that you have there, like the country that you're in, you know, your name, I don't know. These are information that might be shared or not, and that might help to gather data. Satellite data, of course, this will allow us to have, you know, now, for instance, for climate change, this is really important. If you look at data, if you look at satellite data from the last, I don't know, 20 years in a country, you're going to be able to see how green pastures have evolved. Are areas for farming and agriculture growing or diminishing? You can see that through satellite data. And of course, you also have other methodologies like machine learning, artificial intelligence, and they will allow you to get a lot more data as well, data mining, etc. Okay, so pros and cons of each type of data that we've considered. So let's talk about first census. So what are the pros? What are the advantages of census data? It's universal, right? That's what I was telling you. This is great. This goes into the tiniest of details. It's comparable cross-country, because with census we try so that countries use the same definitions. and the same questions that are guidelines and international agreed upon questions that countries should ask about. So that makes it really, really a great tool. And of course, it's very rich. There's a lot of details on it. So that's why we love census data. What are the disadvantages? Well, yeah, it's very expensive to do, so it doesn't happen that often. We only have it once every 10 years. It doesn't give us information on individual causes of movement. What happened? Why are you moving? What happened after you moved, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't give us a lot of good data on emigration, right? People that leave the country, because by definition, a census is only done within your border, right? So you're not going to be able to know how many people of your nationality are outside in the world, right? You're only asking questions within your border. Okay, surveys. So what are the advantages of surveys? So you can basically ask any question you want, right? It's very flexible. You can ask about any domain, any topic to identify migrant groups of interest. You can talk about causes, consequences, et cetera, et cetera. Problem with survey data is, of course, getting to the point where you have a large enough sample size to be able to have robust and significant results in terms of statistics. And of course, because you need large samples to be able to have robust results, this also is a very expensive type of data collection. Okay, and then we go to administrative data. Administrative data is great because it's very cheap. It means that we do not have to run a data collection, and we're just using data that already exists because of just the normal work that the government does. So what do we talk about when we're talking about administrative data? For instance, visas, number of tourist visas or work visas, or the number of student permits. This is super useful in terms of migration data, at least regular migration, of course, because it allows us to know immediately the number of tourists, the number of workers that are in a particular country. And yeah, great. We don't have to spend any money to collect it because it's already there, right? The government is already collecting this data. So this is, of course, great because it's cheap, but it's not flexible at all. If you're a researcher, you have no control about the definitions that are employed, how it's going to be collected, when it's going to be collected. You're just taking advantage of something that is already there, right? But yeah, at least this is something that can be very useful, but you do have to play with the particularities of it. Now, what are some of the things that are important to know about administrative data? So these are number of records. This is not number of people. So the same person can have multiple visas. They can be a tourist, but then they started, I don't know, a master's abroad. So they will also be getting a student visa. And when they stop their studies, they might get a job and their student visa might overlap with their work permit. So we have 3 different situations, right, for the same person. So they might have duplications or triplications of what is there. Coverage issues. Again, as I was telling you, right, we have no control about where what definitions are employed, when these visas are given, why they are given, what definitions are used. So we have no idea if this is going to cover all of the context that we want or not. And then, of course, this is done for administrative reasons. This is not done thinking about statistics and people that are doing studies. So definitions might be really different across across different regions, for instance, et cetera, et cetera. So, just to a word of caution into using administrative data. Okay, so let's think about what possible data sources we can have for different categories, okay? So let's talk about, okay, firstly, immigrants, right? So I think, if you want data on people entering the country, you might go to the border, you might talk to a border official, and you ask them how many foreigners have registered right there at the border, right? And came in. That will give you data on that. If you want data on migrant workers, you can ask for employer records, right? You can have work permits, you can talk about social security, etc. If you want data on irregular migrants, so you can also ask law enforcement. You might have data on entry refusals, on returns to different countries. Remittances, data on money that is sent from abroad to your country, you can ask that of central banks. Data on seasonal workers, so people that come in, just because of agriculture or tourism in the summer or the winter. This can be accounted for in border statistics and recruitment agencies. And if you want data on immigrants, so people leaving, you can get that from borders and from embassies, right? So there's always different ways of gathering data. I hope you receive me well. I see there's a person commenting that there's a bad connection. I hope that's it's on, at least on their side, and not on my side. So let me know.
So far, everything is fine on our side, but sometimes, depending on where you are, the internet might fluctuate. But
okay.
Please continue. If we have any problem, we will let you know.
Thank you so much. Perfect. Okay, so next slide. Let's continue. Tick, tick, tick. Okay, point number 1 is done then. Key concepts is good. Let's go on then to the local context of migration. Okay, so migration in the context of Sustainable Development Goals. TAC. Okay. I'm sure you've heard about the SDGs, right? Sustainable Development Goals. These have been officially recognized as a force, as something that is very, very important to make sure that we have inclusive development, that we have a reduction in inequalities. And of course, if we want that, we need to have data, right? We need to make sure that we are basing our decision-making on sound policies. So there are 17 goals. They are directly related to migration, and where I'm going to be telling you exactly where. And what they basically do is the SDGs, they address the need for safe, orderly, and regular migration. And they try to recognize the positive contribution that migrants can give to sustainable development. Okay, so where do we have direct connections to migration? We have it in 4 with education, 5 with gender equality, 8 with decent work and economic growth, 10 with reduced inequalities, 16 with peace, justice, and institutions, and 17 with partnerships. And there are also other objectives that have relevant references that also happen to be there. So number 1, which is ending poverty, number 3 on health and well-being, number 13 on climate action, and number 11 on cities. Okay, so where do we see these particular references? For instance, we have targets that have to do with human trafficking and exploitation. So if we want to combat all types of human trafficking and address this exploitation of women and children, we of course need to talk about migration, right? That's the context in which human trafficking happens. Or for instance, when we talk about labor, right, and employment, if you want to have decent labor, if you want to combat child labor, if you want to combat trafficking of forced labor, we're talking about migration. Again, it's a transversal topic. Okay, so we also have in Objective 17, we also talk about the need to be able to disaggregate data by migratory status, right? So knowing statistics by, host community or migrant community, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what are the implications for data here? So we know that aside from everything that we've already discussed, we need countries to be able to collect, analyze, and disseminate data on indicators of the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also know that there's a need to disaggregate data by migratory status, right? So what's been happening so far? So far, there are still, I would say in 2017, it was 2/3, now it's about half of the indicators that still don't have a lot of data for it. Migration indicators still remain relatively underdeveloped in what the SDGs are concerned, and there's a need for countries to improve their capacity to be able to report on migration indicators. So what happens here? In terms of data, we know that this is a challenge to be able to collect this kind of data, but this is also a very good opportunity. An opportunity to what? Firstly, to refine definitions and concepts, right? To be able to make sure that we're all using the same definitions. It's an opportunity to produce regular, high quality and reliable data for people that have to be deciding on policies. It's an opportunity to explore new sources and new methods of migration data. It's an opportunity to build the evidence base for migration and for development policy. And it's also a very, very good opportunity to improve on mechanisms of coordination that take place with different ministries, with other organizations, with stakeholders at both national and regional level. Okay, we've discussed the global context. Now let's go to the African context and what happens with migration in Africa. So the African Union has an agenda for 2063. Let's see, that it's kind of a blueprint, right, for development at the continental level.
C'est quelque chose qui ressemble
and it highlights the contribution. I'm listening to my own translation. Could we mute my own translation, please? I'm listening to myself speaking in French.
Oui, attends.
Oui, s'il te plaît. Parce que la machine de l'autre la déconne.
I'm not sure if everyone else is hearing, yes, duplicate. Okay.
Oui, sors-moi les cabines, s'il te plaît, Charles.
Yes, yes.
1 second.
We are hearing that, please.
Just 1 second.
Ok, Fal, c'est bon.
Thank you very much. Perfect. Okay, let's continue then. So as I was saying, and this agenda basically highlights that we want to, the African Union wants to make sure that there is free movement of individuals across the continent. That's the goal, okay? So to be able to get that happening, they have this action plan from 2018 to 2030 that, of course, highlights the need to have systematic, comprehensive data on migration to be able to improve decision making, of course. So, from a statistical perspective, what do we have? We have the African Charter on Statistics. We have StatAfrique, which is the statistical organ of the African Union, and their mandate is exactly to harmonize data collection and analysis across the continents. Okay, so now just a few indicators for your knowledge of recent statistics in Africa. So firstly, what can we say? African countries have, on average, more immigrants than immigrants, okay? So where do we see it? We see here immigrant stock. So these are number of people that leave, and these are number of people that go in. So as you can see, all African countries together, 40 million versus 25 million. So definitely there are more people leaving, more immigrants than immigrants, people coming in. And this is the same across all regions, right? North Africa, West and Central Africa, Eastern Horn of Africa, and Southern Africa, right? You see that the balance is always negative, so you have more people going out than people coming in. Okay, this is the first thing. Now, second slide. Okay. Oh, did I go to? No, this is good. Okay. Second, most international migrants, they do not leave the African continent. So again, here, if you take all African countries together, the number of people that are migrants in the continent, so you see here, in 20.8 million, let's say, and the people that go out of the continent, it's 20.7. So it's almost the same. It's almost the same. I agree with you. But in terms of numbers, right? But there we have more people in. And as a percentage of all migrants, so this is the absolute number. But then what do these numbers represent as a percentage of all migrants? So as a percentage of all migrants that are in the region, Africans represent 82% of all the migrants that are in Africa, whereas Africans only represent 51% of all of the migrants that are outside of Africa. So here, this is just to highlight that, again, most migrants do not leave the African continent. Most of them are within the continent, okay? And next slide. This is just some statistics on refugees. So refugees and asylum seekers represent a high proportion of all of the international migrants in Africa. So again, let's look at all African countries together. You see, okay, numbers of refugees and asylum seekers in the African continents and outside the African continents. So within the African continents, refugees and asylum seekers, African refugees and asylum seekers represent 30% of all of the migrants, which is a lot. Whereas outside of the African continent, refugees and asylum seekers represent 20% of all migrants, okay? And this is especially, look at Eastern Horn of Africa. This is the region of the continent that has the highest percentage of refugees and asylum seekers. See, North Africa has the least about, and Eastern Horn of Africa is definitely the region that hosts more refugees and asylum seekers. Okay. So just some key statistics. This is from 2020 from UNDESA. Okay, so what is data important for? Data is crucial to be able to monitor progress towards your objectives, and data is crucial to be able to disaggregate our migration statistics by migratory status. Okay. As I was telling you, the African Union has this 2018-2030 plan, right? that that basically has a certain number of policy guidelines and principles that will help in the implementation of migration policies, right? So this is the plan. Now, this plan is divided into 8 pillars in terms of migration. They talk about migration governance, so this is basically laws. They talk about irregular migration, right? How can we make sure that this is minimized? They talk about labor migration and education. So these are people that migrate to look for a job or they migrate to study abroad. They also talk about forced displacement. So these are victims of trafficking, victims of sexual exploitation, etc. We talk about diaspora engagement. So diaspora are our immigrants, the people from our country that are abroad, that are able to contribute to the growth of our country, be it through remittances or other opportunities. We talk about internal migration. So this is within your country, rural, urban, etc. Border governance. So this is in terms of laws that laws that govern the crossing of borders, how people can do it and when and how. And then migration and trade, of course. As you can imagine, migration is very, very important for how trade happens within and between countries. Okay, so there are many, many different issues that are highlighted in terms of migration, as I was telling you. So you can talk about development, data and research, human rights, non-discrimination, poverty, conflict, health, environment, gender, older persons, interregional cooperation, children, adolescent, youths. Again, this is just to highlight the extent to which migration is a transversal topic, right? And it really is important for everything that we might be discussing. So the plan of action that we have, that the African Union has, focuses on specific issues and tries to provide government authorities with the conditions and the elements to be able to properly manage migration. What the ultimate goal is to be able to foster integration, right? What I was telling you about with the freedom of movement, and to be able to accelerate economic and social development as well as political stability. Okay, so in 2010, there was a strategy for the harmonization of statistics in Africa initiative that was launched. It was updated to cover the period of 2017-2026. So this is something that is really, let's say, a priority for Africa. And they know that, of course, data is the basis for all decision making. So this is something that cannot be overlooked. So what does the strategy tell us? This strategy tells us that to be able to generate timely, reliable, and harmonized statistical information, we need to be able to cover different elements of migration. We need to be able to cover the environmental dimension, the social dimension, economic dimension, as well as the cultural and political dimension of it. Is it easy? No, definitely not, but it's needed. That's exactly why migration is a transversal topic, because it touches upon very, very different dynamics. Okay, we're halfway there. And I promise you the second half is shorter. So let's talk about the disaggregation of data by migratory status. So why do we have this principle of leaving no one behind? Because there is a significant and a growing number of migrants worldwide. This is the first thing that we need to know. So as of now, 272 million migrants exist. So taking into consideration that this is a growing number, we need to make sure that they are considered in policies and programming. We need to make sure that these people are not forgotten, that their rights are taken into consideration. Why? Because, as I was telling you at the beginning, migrants can be vulnerable, because from the moment that they leave their place of residence, from the moment that they leave their country, they might not have the same rights as everyone else. So they might be in jeopardy and in vulnerable situations. And that's exactly what we want to make sure, and what we want to make sure we try to prevent, at least. So what does this leave no one behind policy mean? This basically means that we can only achieve full policy objectives when migrants are fully considered into them, okay? So let's say if migrant children are a large proportion of the global child population, then we need to make sure that the needs of migrant children are taken into account when we're designing education policies, or else they will just be forgotten, they will be left behind. And this is what we don't want to happen. So when we talk about this, and when we want to make sure that we leave no one behind, we need to talk about the disaggregation of data, right? Because if we want to make sure that particular genders aren't left behind, or elderly people or children aren't left behind, or I don't know, lactating mothers or pregnant women, or people with mental disabilities, people with physical disabilities. This means that we need to improve the quality of statistical data, and that these subsets of the population are represented there. Why does it matter? Well, because these populations, these subsets of the migrant population, they suffer from particular and important vulnerabilities. So let's say we might want to know if migrant women have a higher mortality than non-migrant women. If we know that, we would be able to target specific measures and interventions to be able to mitigate these sort of actions and to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But of course, to make sure that this doesn't happen again, we need to first know the phenomena, right? And that's why it is important to disaggregate statistics by migratory status. Again, so there's not enough data on migrant well-being, on their integration, etc. And this is where disaggregation can help to address these gaps. This will also contribute to the mainstreaming of migration in many different areas. And it can help governments make sure that migration is taken into account into all of the different ministries. It might also show us where migrants are agents of growth and where they actually help the development of a particular country. This is, of course, exactly what we want to highlight and make sure it happens. So, for instance, this is an example of disaggregated data by migration status. We have employment. We show the percentage of unemployed population right here. And we know that more or less 6% of the native born are unemployed, and 9% of the foreign born are unemployed. And when we talk about high skilled employment, we see that 85% of the native born have a high skill employment, and only 76% of the foreign born have this high skilled jobs. This is an example of just data that is disaggregated by migratory status. So how do we define this disaggregation? Well, we might think about country of birth, right? This is the example that was in the previous slide, foreign-born and native-born. Or we can talk about country of citizenship, foreigners and national citizens, both valid, both correct. It just depends on what exactly you want to highlight. Okay, data innovation. We're down to our 2 last sections, and then it'll be time for questions. So talking about new data sources. So what is big data? Big data is anonymized, okay? They're generated by the users of mobile devices. So a phone, a computer, a digital sensor, satellite imagery, et cetera, and the usage of these devices, it leaves traces. It's going to leave an imprint, right? A record of a call, of a message in very, very large databases. So this will give us, a lot of information when used properly, of course, always taking into account data protection. But these can be very, very useful data sources. And they're useful for what? They might be useful for exploiting new methods or to combine traditional methods with new data sources. So why is this important? Because we don't have enough data as it is. And big data might give us the opportunity to overcome these different gaps in information with these new data sources. Now, what are the issues here? And as I was telling you, issues of ownership, right? Who owns the data? What is happening here? Continuity of data, is it just something that we're going to have in a moment in time and it's not going to be continuous over the years or not? Confidentiality, this is the most important one, I would say. I mean, we need to make sure that we are abiding by data protection and that data is not being shared when it shouldn't be shared. Methodological issues, again, I mean, this is not a data collection exercise, so data that exists just because of a phone company, for instance, it might not be adequate for us to use. Reliability and veracity, of course. Whenever you're not the primary collector of data, you need to make sure that this is taken into account and you're only using data from reliable sources. And yeah, then we need to make sure that it's worth it. We need to make sure that if we're using big data for this, that the data is going to be well taken into account for, and it's going to be of value. Let's not just collect data for the sake of it or use big data for the sake of it. Let's make sure that it's going to be of use and it'll help us bridge the gaps that we have. Okay, so big data for migration. What is being done as of now? We have at IOM the Global Migration Data Analysis Center, GMDAC. There's the European Commission Knowledge Center on Migration and Demography. There's Big Data for Migration Alliance. I mean, honestly, this is not the issue. The number of actors that we have that are trying to use big data is really a lot, which is great. It just means that we're trying to be exploratory and that things are moving in the right direction. Okay, and final point, and then I will shut up, I promise. Communication and dissemination of migration data. So firstly, make sure that the data you're using is valid and reliable. This is the most important thing, of course. From a policy perspective, we need to make sure that the evidence is needed and is used to develop policies to evaluate the effectiveness of past and future actions, and it's going to inform the public debate, right? This not only needs to happen in the form of written documentation, but also in training, in knowledge sharing events, in talking to relevant users. I mean, there are very, very different ways to make sure that people are taken into account and people are going to be informed about what is happening, okay? So how do we determine if the data that we have is useful for users? Well, we answer questions. We make ourselves available to answer their questions. And of course, we justify it. Whenever we are using data, we say what we're going to be using it for and why we need it in that moment in time and in that format. Dissemination, what is the problem here? So we need to make sure that we're using the right channels to communicate data, be it at the national, regional, continental, or the international level. This is difficult. This is not always it's not always easy to know how to properly share data at the right moment. Why? Also because data is often very scattered. The data isn't all in one place. It's not very, very easy to get to it. It's going to depend on the level of computerization of the services, right? Sometimes things are available at the reach of a click, you know, and it's available on the website. And sometimes it's just not. These are difficult questions to answer, and it's really going to depend on context, which is why it's a challenge. What is really, really important to make sure that we have the needed administrative procedures to make sure that data sharing happens in a secure setting, and to make sure that personal data is safeguarded, right? And we're not just sharing data just because, that if we need to share it, it's because it's going to be useful. And that if we are sharing it, any personal data is firstly anonymized and secondly, very well protected. Okay, that is all from me. Thank you very, very much. Let me see if there's any particular question that I didn't answer. Okay, I see one question that I didn't answer. How does the multiplicity of data producing institutions affect the truth about the situation's diagnosis and tracking, especially in light of different approaches to migration research and analysis? Very good question. This is a problem. Why? Because normally when we have different institutions that are producing data, I'm almost 100% sure that they're not going to be using the same definitions. And even if they're using the same definitions, they're not going to be using the same methodologies. So if they're not using the same methodologies and or definitions, the results are going to be different and they're not going to be comparable. If I'm not able to compare different results, then it's just meaningless, you know, or I'm not going to have the same results and I'm not going to be able to compare and see what differences existed, because they're just going to be, you know, different realities. And it's very, very difficult to bring those together. That's why we have all these efforts to make sure that overall people work in the direction of having same methodologies and same definitions, because if they're not the same, then we're just comparing apples to oranges. And of course, you're not going to be able to properly diagnose a situation and track a situation if the methodologies are different. So you either have to stick with one source of data and at least make sure that you're able to compare it across countries and across time. But yeah, it's not an easy thing to do. Okay, another question.
Okay.
What relations does the African Union have with national statistical institutes to produce quality data on migration? Again, very, very good question. So the African Union has initiatives both with international institutions as the United Nations, as well as with national statistical institutes. We work together every year in terms of firstly, capacity building. So giving trainings, making sure that everyone has the same kind of information. And secondly, in producing joint reports. This might not be at the African Union level, but for instance, within ECOWAS, there is now a second edition of a report that's being produced on migration statistics in the ECOWAS region, which is exactly done to make sure that there are at least 20 basic indicators that all countries share. They collect it in the same way, they collect it at the same moment in time, so that at least on these very, very small indicators, we have the same information, right? That's just, that's the basis. So there are at least region-specific initiatives that make sure that this happens. My email address, yes, of course, I can share it. Let me put it in the chat. Int.
Hello, Louisa. Hello, Louisa.
Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Theophilus. I'm taking over from Mr. Ibrahim Akan to moderate because Zainab is also around, but I think she's caught up in an emission, so she will also be following. So there are some hands that have also been raised, so we give them the opportunity to also ask their questions, and then you respond to them, if that's okay.
Of course, I wasn't seeing the hands up, so I see.
Yeah. So we have 3 hands up. So maybe we'll take to the 3 questions, then you attend to them. So we have Henry. Henry, if you can ask your question.
Yes, I am here. Good morning to all, and good morning to Louisa. Yes, so in connection to migrant stock, I would like Louisa to elaborate on the migrant stock, in a sense that is it a report that is prepared within a period of time, or it is a report that is gathered on a daily basis?
Okay, thank
So
you.
migrant
So Louisa, if you can just take the 3 questions, or you want clarification? Maybe we take up to some 4 questions, then you respond to them, then we take another batch. Okay, so the next, Cisse, please, can we hear you?
N'ayez pas tout Cisse. Ok.
Bien sûr. Bonjour, merci beaucoup à lui pour cette excellente intervention. C'était très instructif, j'ai beaucoup appris. Félicitations aussi à l'OIM pour les magnifiques initiatives à l'endroit des migrants de retour, surtout en ce qui concerne les migrants ici au Sénégal. La semaine passée, j'étais à Tambacounda dans le cadre de l'emploi vert, de la foire de l'emploi vert, qui est une première édition organisée par OIM. C'était magnifique. Donc, j'ai juste quelques observations par rapport à l'intégration du genre et aussi des autres couches comme les personnes en situation de handicap. Vous en avez parlé. Mais mon souci reste par rapport aux acteurs qui sont dans la chaîne de collecte des données concernant les migrants. Est-ce que ces acteurs sont assez outillés pour mettre à jour les outils de collecte pour une meilleure prise en charge des personnes en situation de handicap qui parfois sont concernées par la migration, pour une meilleure prise en charge des femmes aussi, qui dans le cadre du contexte sénégalais parfois rejoignent leurs époux à l'extérieur. Je ne sais pas si toutes ces considérations sont documentées dans les données qui sont mises à disposition. Voilà, je ne veux pas monopoliser la parole. En attendant, ce sont ces quelques observations que j'avais notées. Merci beaucoup. Merci. La parole est à vous.
Okay, thank you. Mohamed, let's hear you. If Mohammed is not there, Henry, since your hand is up again.
Yes.
Hello? Hello?
Hello.
Okay, Henry.
Yes.
Henry.
Hello?
I have another question.
Hello?
Can I go ahead?
Okay, Henry, go ahead.
All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity. And also, I would like to ask a question in connection to the sources of data collection, migrant data collection, particularly census. I would like to ask that in a situation where in Africa, typically our borders are porous in the sense that we have people coming in and moving out of the country or the borders without any proper documents or without any proper documentation on them. In this case, if you are carrying out a census, how are those individuals being captured in the census to give a fair and a clearer reflection of migrants that comes in and out of our borders at a particular point in time? Thank you.
Okay, so we'll take Yaya, then Louisa will answer this question. So Yaya, let's hear you.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And I also want to thank the presenter for that wonderful presentation. My issue is similar to Ghana, but just to be specific, it's about data collections and analysis, because I know there are still challenges as to data collection and analysis as far as migration is concerned. And she did mention about the initiatives of African Union when it comes to harmonization of data or migrant data. So I just want to want her to just explain what are some of the challenges in terms of this harmonization of data, and because if data are not being harmonized, normally that's where we have issue of variance in terms of what is being reported in Africa, what is reported in other organizations. So just to elaborate more on some of the challenges that we are having as far as harmonization of migrant data is concerned, because characteristics of data collections also might differ, given that this harmonized framework, not all countries have the capacity, particularly in terms of collection of migrant data. So that's what I just want some more clarification and more explanation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Louisa, if you can take these questions. There are few of them also in the comment box. Okay, thank you.
Perfect, thank you very much. Okay, so stocks. So these are not taken on a daily basis because it's very hard to do it. I mean, if we're talking about national level statistics, it would be too expensive, and it wouldn't even be possible to collect information on the number of all migrants present in the country in one single day, right? So even for the census, you know that the period of data collection for a census takes, well, you know, several weeks, even sometimes a couple of months. And it's still a stock. It's still a stock taking of course, that, you know, in that period of time, there might be some small changes because people move all the time, but it's just not possible to collect data on an entire country in one single day. So that's just, you know, it is what it is. It is a practicality. So stocks normally are taken, I would say, normally yearly, you know, but it corresponds, it's yearly because it's just a very expensive exercise, and you do it over the course of some weeks, let's say, depending on, of course, the size of the population that you're trying to measure. If it's just a region, if it's just 1,000 people, it's going to be a very short data collection. If it's 20 million people, then it's going to take a lot more time, you know, yeah, not days, not one day for sure. It would normally be in the weeks. Second question on disaggregation. Yes, it's very difficult because disaggregation, as we were saying, might talk about Gender might talk about disability status, might talk about pregnant mothers, lactating mothers. It might talk about, I don't know, different migratory status, if they're regular or irregular. I mean, it might talk about the age, right? If they're under 2-year-olds, under 5-year-olds, if they're elderly. So this is really, really complicated. I fully agree with you. One of the most challenging aspects, not only in Senegal, but in the entire world. And it's just something that we need to improve upon. It's not going to happen over time. Just to have sex and age and gender disaggregated data, that would already be amazing. Honestly, we're not even at that level yet. So as you can imagine, for disabilities and everything else, it's even more complicated. So it just means that institutions like the African Union and the individual states need to do a lot better, and us as well. Every organization needs to do a lot more in terms of that. Third question on migrants coming in and out, and what to do when you're not sure about the particular categories that they're in, right? Be it if they're documented, if they're not documented, if they have a passport or not. Often they don't. I mean, these are very difficult situations to ascertain. Some migrants, some people are stateless. They don't even have a national identity. So first you have to make sure that you know what their country of origin is. That's not always simple to do, but it just goes to show that you need to go step by step. When you're trying to take information on migrants, let's first determine the nationality of the person. If they don't have a nationality, let's try to find their family. Let's try to see their country of origin. And from nationality or country of origin, you are then able to determine everything else. If they're a migrant, if they're a refugee, if they are an internally displaced person, et cetera, et cetera. So it needs to go step by step. It's not going to be perfect, but you can do it. I mean, people don't exist in isolation. They have family. There are health records. There are other people that know them and that are able to help with this categorization. The last question on analysis, harmonization. Yeah, again, very complicated. It will depend on the characteristics of not only the institutions, but the people that are doing the analysis. They need to make sure that they first agree upon the type of analysis they want to make. They need to make sure that they agree upon the type of data that is going to use, that they're using the same definitions, the same methodologies, and only then can you make sure that you're using the same type of analysis. Okay, written questions. Does the absence of border control affect and compromise data on migration? Yes, of course. If we don't have, I mean, it's never going to be perfect. It's impossible to have border controls on every single centimeter of any country's borders. But of course, I mean, migration will always happen, regardless of there being a person at the border to count you or not. So yes, to have a better control and a better management of your borders, that will be better both for the migrants and for the countries, because they will be able to know everyone who is going in and going out, and to be able to quantify every single positive aspect and contribution that the migrants are able to bring to the country. But of course, the capacities aren't always there. And I would say it's even impossible to completely control this, because again, borders are porous, right? It's not possible to have everyone at every centimeter. Is it not possible to put in place a partnership between IOM and the African Fund for Development on statistics on migration? Yes, of course, and I think it even exists. Let's see, I heard you mentioning migration mainstreaming. How can that be done, since now there are issues of gender, also climate change to cite that needs mainstreaming? Yes, very good question. Agreed. everything needs to be mainstreamed right now, right? That's the feeling that I also have. It's not easy to do it at all. But I mean, these two, I agree with you. Like climate change and gender are two of the main ones that we cannot ignore anymore, right? We know how important this is, and I know you're going to have another session specifically on climate change. I think it's even going to be tomorrow or something like that. So I'm sure you're going to address that. And gender is the most basic one, right? So at least to have gender and age disaggregated data, this should be the bare minimum that we are striving to do. Is it always doable? Not always, but it is the direction that we need to move towards. Okay, last one. My concern is about the different systems for data collection. How will these different systems be harmonized? And may the African Union strategize with a system for the entire continent or for regional blocks? So step by steps, right? I think that as of now, we have regional initiatives, like I was telling you in ECOWAS. In ECAS, they're doing the same. I mean, I know that every different institution is doing it. They're launching their own reports and their own initiatives, and they're doing it based on African Union guidelines. So hopefully there is alignment both at continental level and regional level to make sure that these are aligned and that the data that is captured takes into account the same methodologies and the same definitions. How does data privacy affect migration data collection? Well, I've talked about this already, but it just means that we need to make sure that we're taking into account data confidentiality and anonymity. Sorry. So personal data cannot be shared without the consent of people, of the specific people involved. So you cannot share it. That's the end of it. So it needs to firstly be anonymized and only then shared.
Okay, so we have 3 hands up now. Let's take them, then you combine them with the ones in the comment box. So Komlavi, let's hear you.
Ok, oui, merci. Bonjour. Et merci pour m'avoir donné la parole. Pour commencer, je voulais dire tout simplement que, bon, je m'attendais pour cette formation, surtout pour ce module, l'avoir en français tel que Madame l'a commencé. Mais malheureusement, bon, elle a opté pour l'anglais, ce qui défavorise considérablement, bien gravement les gens de la francophonie. Donc, je ne sais pas pourquoi ça passe comme ça. Désolé pour ça, mais bon. L'autre aspect, la question réelle. Bon, mon premier, je vais avoir l'intitulé réel de ce module. Je n'ai pas noté l'intitulé réel de ce module. Et ensuite, par rapport au principe de ne laisser personne derrière. Et j'ai vu par rapport aux données que les femmes allaitantes sont plus victimes ou bien leur nombre est un peu plus élevé par rapport aux personnes qui n'ont pas effectivement eu de suivi. Je veux comprendre, est-ce que c'est en termes de suivi de maternité, de santé, ou où ils ont collecté les données pour identifier que les femmes allaitantes sont les personnes qui sont plus laissées pour compte dans ce principe, dans cette situation de migration. Merci beaucoup.
Okay, Mohamed, let's hear you.
Ok, bonjour à tout le monde. Merci pour la qualité de la présentation. Bon, moi, je constate qu'en Afrique, la production et surtout l'actualisation des données sur la migration est un défi. Donc, surtout, je peux prendre l'exemple sur le Mali, là où je suis. Donc, depuis 2004, on estime le nombre de Maliens établis à l'extérieur à 4 millions. Donc, de 2004 jusqu'à maintenant, à peu près 20 ans, donc ces chiffres n'évoluent pas, n'ont pas évolué, alors que la réalité migratoire change considérablement. Et je sais que l'OIM a un dispositif important de collecte et d'actualisation des données. Si je ne m'abuse pas, il y a une plateforme, je crois, Data Migration Police, il y a une plateforme voilà, des collectes et diffusion des données. Donc, voilà, donc je me demande si l'OIM, dans ce sens, je sais quand même que l'OIM fournit beaucoup d'efforts, surtout au niveau de l'enregistrement des entrées, des sorties au niveau des frontières. Il y a même eu à renforcer la capacité de la police des frontières. Donc, est-ce que l'OIM ne peut pas appuyer techniquement, matériellement les institutions de statistiques et les consulats du Mali à l'extérieur et même les consulats d'autres pays au Mali, donc pour que vraiment nous puissions avoir vraiment des données actualisées en termes de nombre de ressortissants, que ce soit des ressortissants maliens établis à l'extérieur, des ressortissants d'autres pays établis au Mali. Voilà, c'est ce que j'avais comme réaction. Je vous remercie de votre attention.
Okay, Vigon, let's hear you.
Bonjour, j'espère que je me fais entendre. C'est vraiment pour dire merci à la présentatrice pour vraiment cette brillante présentation. Moi, ma question, ça concerne surtout la gestion des frontières. Au regard de la situation aujourd'hui que nous vivons à nos frontières, c'est-à-dire frontières Mali, Burkina, avec les autres frontières, Ghana et autres. Donc, c'est souvent en fait lié au problème de sécurité. Et donc, il se trouve que souvent, quand nous faisons la planification de nos opérations pour la gestion des frontières, il est intéressant pour nous d'avoir des données crédibles sur, comment on appelle, voilà, sur l'immigration, sur les flux, en fait, les hommes qui traversent les frontières, de sorte à mieux gérer. Mais par moment, on a des difficultés effectivement avec l'OIM, c'est-à-dire les structures en charge de la gestion des frontières, parce que ces personnes-là se disent que bon, les hommes de sécurité, il n'est pas intéressant de leur donner ces informations parce que bon, ils ne savent pas ce qu'on va en faire. Parce que pour nous, l'objectif, c'est une meilleure gestion. Et donc, dans nos planifications, souvent, on aurait bien les intégrer dans la planification. Et donc, à leur niveau, ils estiment que c'est non, il s'agit d'une affaire militaire. Donc, eux, ils ne participent pas effectivement vraiment à la planification de nos opérations quand il s'agit de la gestion des frontières. Donc, je voudrais savoir, est-ce que ces données-là, si par moment, il y avait la possibilité d'avoir un moyen de partage d'informations entre peut-être les éléments de sécurité qui gèrent les frontières avec les structures en charge de la gestion des personnes, des déplacés, des réfugiés et puis ce qu'on sort. Donc, vraiment, c'était ça ma préoccupation. Merci beaucoup et bonne continuation.
Okay, thank you. So, Louisa, please take this one, including the ones in the chat. Okay, so Louisa, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So in terms of the first person who was doing their intervention, I mean, there is simultaneous translation, so I hope everyone got the chance to hear me both in English and in French. I could do the presentation in French as well. It's just that there would always be a percentage of the people who would prefer to hear it in a different language, so it really doesn't matter, right? I hope you were able to access the direct translation. In terms of the question on women particularly, so I would say that women have been left behind in statistics, and not only over the last centuries. That has created consequences in terms of the type of data that we have available. Because let's say, even outside of statistics, even in medical studies, normally studies have been made much more in men, so we know a lot less about the reality for women and what happens to their bodies. That's for medical purposes, but it is the same for statistics, because historically women have been less represented in the labor force, it means that the majority of data that we have with regards to that represents data on men. And now we need to make sure that we're taking adequate stock of the reality. And the reality now is that women are a lot more represented both in workers, but as well as in migrants. Women are migrating more and more. So it's just a point to make sure that we need to reflect reality and make sure that women are as represented as men. With regards to the second comment on working with national statistical offices and to the particular example of Mali, yes, IOM does that. I've recently we work with all of the national statistical offices, to be honest. I've recently worked with the government of Gabon, for instance, on the establishment of a national statistical institute. We provide capacity building. I've recently worked on a workshop done with Statafrique, so with the entire African Union, on a workshop on diaspora and their contributions to statistics and to the development of African countries. So yes, please be assured that through so I am part of the regional office, but all of the IOM country offices, they work closely with the National Statistical Institutes. There is no data collection that is done they always go through the national statistical offices. The government always gives their authorization for us to do a data collection. So the relationship is really, really very good and very tight. It always happens with them. They always take part in the data collection, in looking at the questionnaires. And this is something that we, of course, want to reinforce. As for the last question on border management, yes, absolutely. IOM has a specifically devoted unit only to that. It's called IBM, so International Border Management, and it is specifically devoted only to the proper management of borders, having data around what happens at the borders, reinforcing the capacity of governments to be able to know the reality that's on the ground, to be able to have orderly and regular migration as much as possible. So yes, I could not agree more on the need to have accurate border management. And yes, IOM, it's not the unit that I'm in, but IOM has a unit that is particularly related to that. And just to make sure that I also touch upon the questions on the chat. So short stay of migrants. So what I was telling you here is that these are the definitions that are used internationally for international statistics. So they use 3 months and 1 year, but it really depends on the institution. For IOM, for us, it doesn't matter if you're a migrant for 1 hour, it doesn't matter if it's 1 day, it doesn't matter if it's 3 years. The moment that your rights might be put in jeopardy, or you might be in a vulnerable situation just because you crossed the border during, I don't know, 1 day, for us, during that 1 day, you're a migrant, okay? So that's because IOM takes the stance of protection. We want to make sure that we protect people whenever they might be in a vulnerable situation. Now, for national governments, it's going to be different, of course. They need to be more, they do not have the means or the money or the capacities to be able to track everyone that, might cross the border just for 3 hours during the day because they want to buy something, right? It's different. So for them, what matters is more the big picture. So when you're talking about the big picture, then they're talking about migrants that move for more than 3 months, because that lets you know that this person is more or less, divided between the 2 countries, or at least they're staying in a different country for a significant period of time. It really depends on the objective and the goal of the data collection. For us, because we are concerned about protection, even 1 hour counts. But for a national government that is more concerned about national statistics on a yearly basis, let's say, for them, the 3 months is the most relevant characteristic. So yeah, it's complicated. I know that unfortunately, there's no, particularly right or wrong answer. It all depends on the objectives of your data collection and what you need the data for. In some countries, there are informal crossings. How can that data be collected? So informal crossings might be collected if we have knowledge about the routes that are taken by migrants. We can ask them, how many people have you crossed the border with? But if migrants are in an irregular situation, they often are not, they might not feel comfortable sharing data as well. So this data is really not, it's very hard to get data on it, exactly because these are crossings that happen when outside an official crossing point, right? So normally here, what authorities try to do is they try to make people cross through the official border points. Does that happen all the time? No, because as I was telling you before, migration is fluid. Migration is something that is very hard to fully comprehend, exactly because borders are enormous. There are millions of kilometers of borders throughout the world, and it's impossible to have a border person at every centimeter, right? So it's always going to happen, but we can try to collect that sort of data, asking migrants themselves that we know crossed the border through these points, who they crossed with, how many people crossed, et cetera, et cetera. So you might try to get data that way. How effective is migrant data collection via phone and social media? Yeah, it's never perfect. Data collection is never perfect. Here, what's the problem? Not everyone has a mobile phone, and not everyone has an internet connection. So that's the main thing there. Of course, some might even use a VPN connection to hide their location. What does this mean? This means that we need to use different data collection methods. No, not one data collection method is ever going to be perfect. It's impossible. We're always going to have gaps. That's why we need to use different data collection methodologies to make sure that we cover these gaps, right? Because nothing is ever going to be perfect. Okay, I think I've answered everything so far, and I don't see any hands up. So we have 7 minutes left. I think that's it from me, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, Saria has gone.
See, madam. Thank you.
Merci.
Ok, merci pour cette session aussi.
Folks.